Live from the JLE in London, you're listening to History for the Curious, the podcast. 20 minutes with Rabbi Aubrey Hersh, hosted by myself, Mena Reisner. Join us as we cross continents, sail through the centuries, tracing lives, uncovering events, and following epic journeys to reveal the untold stories and the mysteries that have impacted our history and shaped us into who we are today.
The news is eventually reported to the king as he's sitting, sort of banqueting. But when the king sent a justiciary to inquire into these crimes, the guilt is, so to speak, found to involve so many citizens that it was felt more prudent to drop the prosecution, and very few suffer punishment.
What was the punishment?
Well, 3 of the ringleaders were hanged. 1 for robbing a Christian, and 2 because the fire they had started burned down a Christian house.
Well,
so little else was done afterwards except to send letters to all parts of the kingdom ordering the Jews to be left in peace. But much worse was to follow. England at the time is overrun with Crusader zealotry and preparation. A crusade which was going to be led by their own King Richard. And the Jews around England this time are targeted. Other cities, hearing of this slaughter of the Jews in London, imitated the example. The Christian writers of the day had written with disapproval that the government of Henry II, even though it was so advanced, had nevertheless protected this infidel Jewish race from all injury and insult. But now the zeal of Richard for liberating the Holy Land gave the population a pretense for venting their animosity against them.
Did this lead to York?
So it culminates with York, and we do not find any intervention by the king as such. Not because we can claim him to be, so to speak, an anti-Semite, but because this does not seem to be something of interest to him, very different to his father in that respect. To give you an example of these riots, in February, the first outbreak is in King's Lynn in Norfolk, and the Jewish community there is almost wiped out. A few days later, Norwich suffers the same fate, and then there are large numbers of Crusaders who had assembled in Stamford, and they were angry that the enemies of the cross should possess all this money when they didn't even have enough money to make the journey yet. So they attack these Jews and they killed anybody who didn't get to safety in time. And now, in July 1190, this is post-York, 8 months into his reign, Richard travels to the Middle East with his armies to begin the Third Crusade. 3 years later, this crusade ends with no result. His goal had been to liberate Jerusalem, as he writes, "Jerusalem is for us an object of worship that we could not give up even if there were only one of us left." This is what he warned in writing Saladin, his opponent. To which Saladin responded in writing, "Jerusalem is ours as much as yours. Indeed, it's even more sacred to us." So now it's 1192. Richard's forced to admit that even with so many lives lost, the Muslims and the Franks are done for. And as he wrote, the land is ruined at the hands of both sides. Just by the way, one of his skirmishes out there was the slaughter of 3,000 Muslim hostages, men, women, and children, in sight of the armies of Saladin. So much for the legend of chivalry. But it's a stalemate. On Richard's return to England, he is captured by his enemy, the Duke of Austria, and a ransom of £100,000 is the price for his release. So in England, every fibre is strained by the king's mother, Eleanor, who has now been released from prison on her husband's death, and she's agitating for Richard. But in order to raise the amount, the Jews are made to contribute disproportionately. They are assessed at 5,000 marks, which is 3 times as much as all of the citizens of London, which was the wealthiest in the country. And the Jewish representatives are summoned to Northampton, March 30th, 1194, to decide what amount each community would pay. And this get-together is a particularly valuable record of medieval English Jewry, because it tells us where the Jews lived. There are 20 major communities. It also tells us that the most important ones were London, Lincoln, Canterbury, Northampton, and Gloucester. And it's interesting that places like York and Stamford and Lynn, where the worst outbreaks had happened 4 or 5 years earlier, are conspicuous by their absence. They haven't built themselves up. In other words, in short, and in contrast to his father Henry II, Richard the Lionheart's reign marks the decline of the Jews in England, and it would end a century later with their expulsion. And in Cecil Roth's book, the reign of Richard is entitled The Beginning of Persecution.
So you mentioned earlier that wasn't coming from necessarily anti-Semitic reasons. What was it from?
They are being unprotected by the king, who has a very short-term view that taxation will outweigh all other considerations, and that becomes the norm for the next century until they're kicked out. Whereas, a less confrontational monarch would have been able to think longer term. Under his rule, the Jews go from being a protected group, albeit second class, to becoming a prop for the kingdom, or for the king, really. And his general legacy is failure. He always wore scarlet as a symbol of war, but he lost the wars he fought with his father. He didn't secure Jerusalem. His own country is neglected. Unlike his father, Henry II, whose input into the country reformed, laid some of the present-day foundations of the legal system, the jury system. In opposition to this, the belligerent son Richard spent less than 6 months in total in England during a 10-year reign. So, his involvement in the alleged story of Robin Hood would have been extremely unlikely. Anyway, he didn't speak English. He isn't buried in England. There's not a lot to talk about.
So the Lionheart was probably a nickname he coins for himself, potentially. I suppose it's also a shame he couldn't have taken out his anchor by writing an autobiography.
Yes, rather than in bloodshed, because England, the Jews, and the land of Israel would all have been a better place for it. So, yes, dysfunctional family and its effect on the Jews. But let's end on a positive note, related only to the idea of influential family squabbles and their outcome on the national scene.
I'm sure we could devote a series to that.
Yes, but this is one story, a true story, in fact a story within a story. In 1827, William B. Astor Sr. bought a large portion of Fifth Avenue, all the way from 32nd to 35th Street. And 2 Astor houses were built there over the years, next to one another. In 1893, William Waldorf Astor, motivated by a dispute with his aunt Caroline Webster Astor. Basically, the dispute was over who should be called Mrs. Astor, should it be his aunt or his wife. He builds the Waldorf Hotel next door her house by knocking down his father's mansion at the corner of 5th Avenue and 33rd. Now, Astor never stayed in his own hotel when he visited the US, and in fact, he probably only visited the Waldorf once. But the construction of this hotel next to his aunt's house basically exacerbated his feud with her, and she was forced out of her home. So she pulls down her house with the help of her son, and they build their own hotel next to the Waldorf, the Astoria, 4 years later in 1897.
What are the chances?
And they capitalized on the success that the Waldorf had already gained. Anything you can do, I can do better. Anything you can build, I can build too. Bigger, better. The Astoria is 270 feet, 16 stories, at least 3 floors taller than the other one. Now, eventually, the Astoria was leased to a guy called George Bolt, who had helped to open the Waldorf years earlier, so he's involved in both. And he goes on to mediate between the 2 feuding families, and they join these 2 hotels together, forming the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and a 300-meter bridge was built between the 2, and the bridge obviously symbolizes a physical link and the rejoining of the families and the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Now, there is an alleged anecdote that tells the rise of Waldorf's first manager, George Bolt, in that many years ago, or many years prior, on one stormy night, an elderly man and his wife entered into the lobby of a small hotel in Philadelphia looking for shelter from a raging storm, and the couple was desperate for a room. The front desk manager looks down the list of reservation and realizes that all the rooms are taken. So he says to them, "I can't send a couple like you out into the rain. Would you perhaps be willing to sleep in my room? It's not a suite, and you'll be comfortable." They took up the offer. The next morning, the husband tells the manager, "You're the kind of individual who should be the boss of the best hotel in the United States. Maybe someday I'll build one for you." 2 years later, this guy receives a letter from that couple with a ticket to New York. When he arrives, they take him to 5th Avenue. They point towards a tall new building, and the elderly man says, "This is the hotel I'd like you to manage, Waldorf." Now, in the obituary of Bolt, published in 1916, the New York Times finally revealed the true story. Turns out there's something to it. Bolt and his family gave up their rooms at a resort for relatives of the Astors and their sick child. The child recovered, and later the relatives persuaded millionaire Astor that Bolt, who did manage a hotel in Philadelphia, was the man he was looking for to manage his new hotel in New York, the Waldorf Astoria. So Bolt did set the gold standard of hospitality.
Well, brilliant. One episode we covered Richard the Lionheart and the Waldorf Astoria.
Exactly.
All thanks to Prince Harry. Thank you, Rabbi Hersh. Fascinating special. And looking forward to hearing next week's. As usual, please subscribe and follow so you don't miss another episode. And do keep sending to podcasts@jad.org.uk all your feedback. It's always appreciated. Thank you.